1241. The plains of Europe tremble. 10,000 crusaders, knights and footmen stand shoulder to shoulder, staring at a black horizon. Dust clouds rise, the Mongol horde, undefeated in 50 years, sweeping west like a storm. By nightfall, the myth of Mongol invincibility will lie broken in the mud, and Europe will learn that even the perfect war machine can bleed. For half a century, the Mongol Empire had been unstoppable. From the frozen forests of Siberia to the burning plains of Persia, their banners rolled across continents like thunderclouds. Cities that refused to open their gates vanished from maps. Armies twice their size had been erased before sunset. To the people of Europe, they weren't soldiers. They were a force of nature, a punishment from heaven itself. By the early 1240s, that storm had reached the edge of Christendom. Scouts brought back impossible stories. Villages turned to ash overnight. Entire garrisons cut down by riders who appeared from nowhere and vanished the same way. No one had ever defeated them. Not the Rus, not the Khwarezmians, not even the mighty Song dynasty to the east. And now, they were crossing the Carpathians. At their head rode Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, carrying his grandfather's ambition westward, and beside him the true architect of destruction, Subutai, the general who had planned every Mongol conquest from the steppes to the Black Sea. Cold, methodical, utterly without mercy. Together, they commanded more than 100,000 men, veterans of wars that had swallowed nations. In their path lay Europe, divided, suspicious, unprepared. The kingdoms of Poland and Hungary bickered like brothers at a funeral. Their armies were brave but disorganized, their nobles more concerned with rank than strategy. Few believed the Mongols would come so far west. Fewer still believed they could win if they did. And then, in the spring of 1241, the horizon turned black. Smoke columns rose from the plains of Hungary. Refugees poured westward. Peasants, monks, even soldiers, their faces gray with dust and disbelief. They spoke of villages burned in silence, of arrows falling like rain, of a new kind of war no one understood. Europe had fought crusades, rebellions, and holy wars, but nothing like this. The Mongols didn't fight for land or glory. They fought to erase resistance itself. And as that darkness rolled closer to the heart of the continent, one truth became clear. If someone didn't stand and fight, there soon would be no Europe left to defend. For centuries, Europe had been too proud to stand together. Kings quarreled like brothers dividing an inheritance, popes fought emperors, and crusaders had shed as much Christian blood as Muslim. But when word spread that the Mongols were coming, when smoke rose from Polish villages and riders never returned, pride gave way to panic. And panic, at last, forced unity. Messengers galloped from castle to castle, bearing one phrase that made every noble's blood run cold. They've crossed the Carpathians. The invincible horde was inside Europe. Entire towns had vanished without a trace. In Krakow, church bells rang for days, not in celebration, but as warning. In Buda, King Bela IV of Hungary ordered every able-bodied man to arms. He wrote to every court in Christendom, to the Pope, to Frederick of Austria, to the princes of Bohemia, begging for men, horses, anything that could fight. And, for once, they answered. From the forests of Poland rode the Teutonic Knights, grim veterans of northern crusades, their black crosses gleaming against the snow. From Bohemia came detachments of heavy cavalry, men who had fought Germans, now swearing to fight beside them. Even rival dukes who had not spoken in years sent banners to the front. It wasn't a grand alliance of nations. It was desperation stitched together by fear. Chroniclers wrote that priests walked among the men, blessing their armor, whispering that they were fighting not for kings, but for Christ himself. Peasants carried icons into camp, the Virgin painted on scraps of wood, the faces worn smooth by touch. Across the frozen plains of Hungary, campfires flickered like 1,000 tiny suns, their smoke rising into the same black sick the Mongols were marching under. They gathered by the Sajó River, 10,000 Europeans standing on land that would soon decide the fate of a continent. To the west lay the villages of Christendom, to the east the dust clouds of an empire that had never known defeat. Some men prayed, others sharpened blades, but all of them felt it, that strange quiet before collision, when history takes its breath. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Subutai's scouts were already watching, counting fires, measuring fear. The Mongols had no idea that this time the enemy waiting for them would not scatter. Europe had finally found something stronger than pride to fight for: survival. When the Mongols reached the Sajó River, they expected another easy conquest. They had swept through Poland, crushed every fortress in their path, and now the plains of Hungary stretched before them. Open ground, perfect for cavalry. To Batu Khan and Subutai, it looked like yet another slaughter waiting to happen. But the Europeans had been watching too. King Bela IV had chosen his ground carefully. His men camped along the western bank, protected by wagons chained together into a rolling wall. Behind them, crossbowmen and archers waited in silence, their weapons aimed toward the only crossing, a wooden bridge fortified with stone towers. They had heard the Mongols preferred to attack under cover of darkness, so Bela gave a simple order: no torches, no fires, no noise. Let the enemy come to ghosts. At midnight, the river began to move, not the water, but the figures crossing it. Mongol scouts slipped through the fog, followed by engineers carrying bundles of reeds and ropes. Then came the horses, endless lines of them, their hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Subutai had planned it perfectly: a silent crossing, an ambush before dawn. But the Europeans weren't asleep. On the far bank, watchmen had heard the faint splash of hooves in water. A single signal arrow streaked into the sky. Within seconds, the camp roared to life. Bells rang, crossbows snapped. The night exploded with fire. The Mongols, caught halfway across, faltered. Arrows poured down on them from the bridge towers. Some horses panicked, plunging into the current. The bridge groaned under the weight, timbers cracking, men shouting in panic. The plan was unraveling. For the first time in years, Subutai, the man who had never failed, faced confusion. He ordered his men to withdraw and regroup, but the river turned against them. The Sajó was high with spring floodwater, its current dragging riders and horses alike into the dark. By sunrise, the crossing was littered with broken armor, drowned men, and shattered siege gear. The survivors crawled back to the eastern bank in disbelief. In the European camp, the soldiers stared across the smoke-streaked water, stunned. They had expected annihilation, but they were still standing. Some began to laugh. Others knelt and crossed themselves, whispering thanks. The Mongols had bled. The Invincible had stumbled. That morning, for the first time in living memory, Europe saw proof that the tide could turn. The men who had ridden out of Asia undefeated had met a wall of wood, iron, and will, and found it would not break. The dawn after the failed crossing rose red and cold. Steam curled off the Sajó River where bodies drifted, Mongol and horse alike. On the western bank, the European army stood restless, armor streaked with soot, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. They had done the unthinkable, stopped the horde in the night. But no one knew what would happen when it came again. At first light, King Bela IV rode the lines. His voice was hoarse, his face streaked with mud and ash, but his presence steadied the men. "They bled," he said simply, pointing across the river. "They bleed as we do." Around him, knights from Bohemia, Poland, and Austria raised their lances in silent answer. Some crossed themselves. Others kissed small wooden crucifixes tied to their hilts. It was the first time many of them believed the Mongols could actually die. Then Bela did what no Mongol had ever expected from a European king. He attacked first. At his signal, trumpets blared and drums thundered. Bridges were rebuilt in haste under a hail of arrows, and the first wave of Hungarian heavy cavalry charged across. Sunlight flashed off steel, hooves shattered the frost, and the ground trembled as two worlds collided. The Mongols loosed arrows in sheets, but the armor of the knights held. Lances drove into their front lines, splintering shields, impaling riders, scattering archers who had never faced an enemy that came toward them. Subutai himself rode into the fray, his horse slick with mud, his face unreadable. He had seen defeats before, feigned ones, deliberate ones, but this was different. His flank buckled under the sheer weight of iron. The European crossbowmen advanced behind the cavalry, picking off fleeing riders one by one. For a moment, the unthinkable was happening. The horde was breaking. Smoke began to rise from the steppe grass as Subutai ordered his men to set fires, using the wind to blind the Europeans. The plain became a swirling fog of heat and ash. Horses screamed, men coughed and stumbled. Visibility vanished, but through the haze, the Europeans still pressed forward, driving the enemy east. Arrows whistled out of the smoke, hitting friend and foe alike. Yet somehow, the line held. When the wind shifted, the Mongols were gone. They had vanished behind the curtain of their own smoke, leaving the field strewn with their dead. The knights reined in their horses, waiting for another charge that never came. All they heard was the wind and the crackle of burning grass. Across the plain, Subutai watched from a ridge, his jaw set. The horde had been repelled, its rhythm broken. For the first time since Genghis Khan's death, a Mongol commander was forced to retreat. Behind him, one of his lieutenants whispered, "They fight like demons." Subutai said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the smoldering battlefield, the black smoke rising toward the western sky, the direction of a world that had just learned to fight back. By midday, the plains of Mohei were a furnace. Smoke from the morning's fires clung to the earth, blurring friend and foe alike. The snow had turned to black mud, slick with blood and ash. Armor steamed in the heat. Horses snorted. Wild-eyed, their flanks streaked red. The Mongols regrouped across the river, reforming under banners torn and dark with soot. They had never faced resistance like this. They were angry now, not cautious, not strategic, but furious. Subutai ordered his trumpeters forward. The air filled with the deep, rolling howl of Mongol horns. It was a sound meant to shatter morale, to remind enemies that resistance was useless. But the men of Europe didn't break. From the opposite bank, the Hungarian horns answered, lower, slower, a heartbeat of defiance. Two armies stared across the smoke, neither willing to move first. Then the wind shifted again, clearing the haze. The Mongols saw the European formation for what it was, not chaos, but resolve. The wagon fort still stood, the archers ready, the crossbows already aimed. The knights had formed a solid crescent, shields locked tight. Behind them, priests walked the lines with crosses held high, chanting over the wounded and the terrified. It was no longer a battle of tactics. It was a battle of endurance. Subutai had one last weapon. He signaled his right flank to feign retreat, drawing out the Hungarian cavalry. It worked at first. The knights surged forward, eager to finish what they'd started. But when they struck the Mongol line, the trick collapsed. The Europeans didn't chase blindly. They stopped, reformed, and pressed in. The Mongol flanks bent. Their arrows ran thin, their horses, bred for open steppe, floundered in the churned soil of the riverbank. Across the field, the Teutonic knights drove their banners straight into the Mongol center. The shockwave of the impact rippled through the line. Men screamed in 3 languages. Lances snapped, shields splintered, and for a moment, a brief, unbelievable moment, the Mongol horde wavered. Then it broke. Subutai's banner dipped once, the signal for withdrawal. What had begun as conquest became survival. He ordered a retreat, not a tactical regrouping, but a flight. His officers tried to rally their men, but panic spread faster than command. Horses collided, riders fell, the river swallowed the wounded. The steppe warriors who had raised empires now fled through the same smoke they had lit. On the far bank, King Bela watched them go. His armor was cracked, his face streaked with dirt, but his voice carried across the roar of the retreat. "Push them!" he shouted. "Drive them east!" The European drums began again, slower now, heavier. The sound of a continent finding its pulse. The impossible had happened. The Mongols were running, and behind them, the men they had called weak and divided were marching into history. The plain was burning when the chase began. 1,000 fires lit the sky, painting the smoke blood red. The Mongols fled east in scattered bands. No longer a formation, just survivors. Behind them came the thunder of hooves, the iron song of vengeance. For the first time in living memory, the hunters were being hunted. King Bela IV led from the front, his white warhorse blackened with ash. Beside him rode knights of every tongue, Poles, Austrians, Bohemians, shouting in a dozen languages but bound by one thought: finish it. The Mongols had razed their lands, butchered their families, and left Europe shaking with fear. Now, with the horde in flight, every lance thrust felt like justice. Across the plains, the ground was slick with mud and bodies. Abandoned wagons smoldered. Mongol bows lay shattered, their once perfect order dissolved into chaos. The steppe horsemen, masters of movement, were losing the one thing they could not fight without: momentum. Their mounts stumbled in the churned soil, their arrows spent. Every turn of the chase was slower, every shout more desperate. And yet, even in defeat, Subutai was calculating. From a ridge, he watched his army crumble and knew what had to be done. He signaled a rear guard to stand, a small group of elite riders who wheeled their horses and turned back toward the oncoming wave. They were not ordered to win. They were ordered to die buying time. The collision was brutal. The rearguard slammed into the European front line with the force of despair. Steel met bone. Spears splintered. The sound was not battle but breaking, of men, of resolve, of illusion. For a moment the charge stalled. Then Bela's knights pressed through, cutting down the last of them and thundering over their corpses. When the smoke cleared, there was no more formation left to fight. By dusk, the steppe was silent again. The Mongols were gone. Some fled east toward the Carpathians, others scattered into the forests where pursuit was impossible. The Europeans reined in their horses at the edge of the plain, gasping in disbelief. They had done it. The invincible army of Genghis Khan's heirs had broken before them. A scout rode up to Bela's side, his face streaked with soot. "My king," he said, "the horde has fallen." Bela looked over the endless field of smoke and ruin. He didn't smile. "No," he said softly. "They've retreated." There's a difference around him. The survivors sat in their saddles, too exhausted to cheer. The air smelled of iron and burnt grass. Somewhere in that gray horizon, the Mongols were still alive, limping east, their legend bleeding out behind them. Europe had survived, but survival, Bela knew, was only the beginning. When the shouting stopped, the silence was unbearable. The battlefield of Mohei was a grave that stretched beyond sight. Horses tangled in broken harness, men lying where they had fallen, banners half buried in soot. The wind carried the stink of blood and ash over miles of scorched grass. Victory, when it finally came, looked nothing like triumph. King Bela IV dismounted and walked through the wreckage, the mud sucking at his boots. His armor was cracked, his sword nicked and dull. He passed the bodies of men who had fought beside him, some with their hands still clutching crosses, others with eyes open to the sky as if waiting for proof that they had actually lived to see the horde run. The priests moved among them quietly, giving last rites in whispers. Even the crows waited. The Mongols had fled, yes, but at a cost so heavy that no one felt the need to count. Thousands of Europeans had died to buy this day. Every field, every river crossing, every hamlet on the frontier had been paid for in flesh. A generation of knights, farmers, and priests now lay silent on the soil they'd sworn to defend. There was no celebration, only exhaustion and disbelief. That evening, as the fires burned low, Bela called his surviving captains. Their faces were gray with smoke, their eyes hollow. None spoke of victory. Instead, they discussed the wounded, the missing, the food that had run out 2 days before. They spoke of fortresses leveled, villages erased. Europe had survived the invasion, but it was a continent bleeding out in slow motion. When the sun set, Bela went to the riverbank alone. He knelt beside the Sajó, the same water that had swallowed Mongols only days earlier. The current carried pieces of shattered armor, driftwood, a single severed banner still clinging to its pole. He washed his hands in the cold water and whispered, "We have survived. Not one." The words drifted with the current, lost among the reeds. In distant monasteries, bells rang in mourning. In the cities of Europe, word spread slowly. The horde was gone, driven back beyond the mountains. People celebrated in ignorance, toasting the saviors of Christendom. But those who had stood on the field knew better. They had stared into the mouth of extinction and crawled back out. They had not beaten the Mongols. They had merely endured them. And as the night deepened over Mohei, the survivors lay awake beneath the stars, wondering if endurance would be enough when the steppe winds rose again. Weeks passed before the survivors understood what had truly happened. The Mongols did not return. Their camps along the eastern frontier were found empty, fires still smoldering, tents abandoned, bodies left unburied. Scouts rode east expecting another ambush, but found only silence and hoofprints leading back toward the steppes. Europe, for the first time in living memory, had driven the horde away. No one in the West knew why. Some said it was divine intervention. Others whispered that Batu Khan had been recalled, that far away in Karakoram, the great Khan had died, and Subutai had withdrawn his armies to secure succession. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. The storm had passed, leaving the continent stunned in its wake. King Bela IV returned to Buda to find his kingdom in ruins. Towns burned, villages deserted, harvests lost to fire and fear. But he did not despair. Instead, he began to rebuild, not just walls and cities, but strategy itself. He ordered the construction of stone fortresses across Hungary, strengthened river crossings, and established a standing army. He swore that never again would Europe be caught unprepared. Across the continent, his example spread. The princes of Poland began drilling mounted archers in the Mongol style. Bohemia built watchtowers along its eastern borders. Even distant France sent envoys east to study the weapons that had humbled the horde. What began as panic slowly turned into evolution. Europe had survived not by divine grace, but by learning, and it would learn faster now. Chroniclers called the Battle of Mohei the day the East met iron. They wrote of the thunder of hooves and the smell of smoke that hung over the plains for weeks, of a river that ran red but carried a message westward, that the age of fear had ended. Songs spread through taverns and monasteries alike, praising the men who stood their ground when the world itself seemed to tilt. The Mongols had shown Europe the cost of division. In return, Europe had shown them that courage and cooperation could wound even the most perfect war machine. The myth of invincibility was gone, replaced by a colder, harder truth, that no empire, no matter how vast, was beyond reach of ruin. And far to the east, Subutai sat by the fires of the returning army, staring into the smoke. He had conquered half the world, but not all of it. Somewhere beyond those mountains, a new kind of enemy had been born, one that bled, but did not bow. Centuries later, the battlefield of Mohei is quiet farmland. The grass grows thick over the bones of men and horses. The Sajó River runs calm again, its current hiding the echoes of screams once carried downstream. There are no monuments here, no grand tombs for kings, only a plain where, for one day, the world's most feared empire met something it could not conquer. The Mongols would never again ride so far west. Their maps stopped at the Carpathians, and the borders of Europe hardened like scar tissue. What they left behind was not just wreckage, but revelation, that no power, however vast, is truly invincible. The Mongol war machine that had crushed empires from China to Baghdad had been slowed, then stopped, by 10,000 desperate men who refused to kneel. Historians still argue whether Mohei was a victory or merely a reprieve. The Mongols withdrew, but not because they were destroyed, because their empire demanded it. Yet for the people of Europe, it didn't matter. The legend had cracked. Fear had met resistance, and resistance had held. In chronicles written long after, scribes spoke of a strange calm that fell over the field when the fires burned out, a silence so heavy that even the crows stayed away. They said the wind that night carried two words in every language: enough blood. King Bela's reforms reshaped his kingdom. Stone replaced timber, unity replaced pride. The children born in the years after Mohei grew up knowing the story, how their fathers had stood against the riders of the apocalypse and lived. They called it not a victory, but deliverance. Today, the plain is peaceful, but on certain mornings, when the mist hangs low over the river, locals say they can hear it, the faint thunder of hooves, far off, fading east. A reminder that on this ground, history turned. Because on that April day in 1241, 10,000 Europeans proved a truth that would echo for centuries, that even an empire built on fear can be stopped by men who have nothing left to lose. And in that muddy field where courage met inevitability, the myth of Mongol invincibility died, and Europe was born anew.